Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. A woman opened her front door in a quiet Florida suburb. A clown handed her flowers, then fired a bullet through her face. That woman was 40-year-old Marlene Warren. It happened on a calm Saturday morning in a neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked and kids biked in tight circles near trimmed hedges. But this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This wasn't a robbery. It was something far stranger. It was personal. Wellington, Florida. May 26, 1990, 10:45 a.m. The Warren residence sat near the end of a curved street in Aero Club, an upscale, gated community known for private planes, country clubs, and clean-cut lawns. That morning, Marlene Warren was home with her son, Joe Aarons, then 21, and a few of his friends. They were finishing breakfast. Nothing unusual until the doorbell rang. According to the initial Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office report, Joe described hearing the chime, then his mother's voice. She said, "Oh, how pretty," he told detectives. Then I heard the gunshot. Joe ran to the door. Marlene was on the floor, bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to the face. The shooter was gone, fled in what he described as a white Chrysler LeBaron. The person who pulled the trigger had been dressed as a clown, orange wig, white face, black nose, oversized shoes, holding a bouquet of red and white carnations and two balloons, one with a picture of Snow White, the other reading, "You're the greatest." None of it made sense. The responding units arrived within minutes of the 911 call, but the shooter was already long gone. EMS stabilized Marlene on scene and transported her to Palm West Hospital. She was placed on life support and died 2 days later, on May 28th, without regaining consciousness. No fingerprints were recovered from the flowers or the balloons. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. The crime scene, aside from the blood on the floor and the floral remnants, looked untouched. Marlene had been deliberately targeted. Initial assessment lead investigator Sergeant Don Swan and his team began with the obvious questions. Who would want her dead? And why the clown? Friends and neighbors described Marlene as polite, reserved, and not involved in anything questionable. She and Michael Warren, her husband of over 20 years, ran multiple businesses, including a successful car dealership and real estate ventures. Outwardly, they lived the American dream, a luxury home, stability, and affluence. But in interviews, Marlene's close friend, Shirley Twing, hinted that Marlene had been uneasy lately. She told me something was going on. She didn't say what. Just said, "If anything happens to me, look at Michael." I remember that. That comment went into the log, but it wasn't evidence. Physical evidence begins to surface. The forensic unit retrieved the two balloons and bouquet for lab analysis. The chrysanthemum stems were fresh. The bouquet's plastic wrapping had partial manufacturer tags indicating it was arranged by a local store, Publix Floral Department, Royal Palm Beach location. Detectives pulled receipts from that day. A cash transaction was made at 9:45 a.m. by a woman wearing a black wig and sunglasses, purchasing the exact floral configuration, plus two helium balloons. Security footage was grainy, degraded by sunlight bleed from the store's front windows, but a partial silhouette was visible. Female, medium height, thick build. She exited the store and entered what appeared to be a white Chrysler LeBaron. That same make and model had been spotted speeding out of Aero Club minutes after the shooting. Investigators traced rental car records. A white Chrysler LeBaron had been rented from a Payless branch 24 hours prior. The rental agreement was signed by a woman using the name Debbie Shannon, with a fake phone number and no traceable credit history. Vehicle was found abandoned 2 days later in a strip mall parking lot. The interior had been wiped down, but a single fiber, orange, synthetic, consistent with clown wigs sold commercially, was embedded between the seat and floorboard. Blood test kits turned up negative for visible fluids, but forensic teams collected latent fingerprints and hair strands from the carpeted mats for further analysis. In 1990, this kind of DNA processing wasn't standard. What they had was circumstantial, physical, but non-conclusive, an unsettling pattern. The bizarre nature of the attack left the department grasping for a motive. The clown disguise seemed theatrical, but it wasn't random. The killer had stalked the victim's schedule closely, arriving at the exact time Marlene would be home alone with the front door unlocked. This wasn't opportunistic, it was orchestrated. The lab later confirmed the wig fiber matched the same retail supplier that sold costume sets to Spotlight Costumes, a local party supply store. That store had reported a customer purchasing a clown outfit. complete with wig, nose, gloves, and shoes 2 weeks prior. The description: woman, medium build, dark hair, paid in cash. By week's end, investigators had connected the balloons to Publix, the costume to Spotlight Costumes, the vehicle to Payless Rentals, and the timeline, tight. All events traced back to the 72 hours before Marlene Warren was shot. But without a suspect or a matching identity for the fake rental alias, the leads stalled. Looking inward, detectives turned attention to Michael Warren. His alibi was airtight. He'd been at the racetrack with business associates at the time of the shooting. But the marriage, according to friends, hadn't been without friction. Michael had a reputation for being controlling with finances. And behind closed doors, there were rumors about infidelity. One name surfaced consistently in anonymous tips: Sheila Keene, a repo agent who worked closely with Michael's dealership. No formal connection between Sheila and the clown attack had been established. No motive was confirmed. No direct evidence existed. Still, something about the planning struck Sergeant Swan. This wasn't a mugging. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a costume, a prop, a getaway car, all prepped in advance. That's not impulse. That's precision. What they had and what they didn't. What they had: a victim with no known enemies, a very deliberate, symbolic disguise. Forensics tied to local businesses, a white LeBaron rented with a false name, an implied timeline of premeditation. What they didn't have: a name, a fingerprint match, a weapon, a motive that could be proven. Marlene Warren was dead. Her son was traumatized, and her husband was grieving, publicly. But off-record, detectives weren't convinced the loss was mutual. In towns like Wellington, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. One front door blown open by a gunshot can unravel a facade of security, predictability, and trust. The clown wasn't just a disguise. It was a calculated mask over a deeper betrayal. From the first 72 hours of investigation, detectives had already begun stripping away the illusion of randomness. The evidence, the white Chrysler LeBaron, the flower bouquet, the clown costume, formed a chain. But what investigators needed now was the link to motive, the reason, the why. They started with the marriage. Michael and Marlene Warren had been married for over 2 decades. From the outside, their life appeared stable. They owned multiple properties. Michael ran Bargain Motors, a used car dealership with a high turnover rate, and contracted repossession services. But when detectives pulled his financial records, inconsistencies surfaced. Several large cash deposits didn't align with reported income. In prior years, the business had been the subject of quiet complaints, including one in 1988 about odometer tampering. The case was closed without charges, but the documentation was flagged. Marlene, meanwhile, managed their household finances. Her records showed stability, no red flags, no debt, and a methodical tracking of their joint assets. She held multiple real estate investments in her own name, including rental units valued at over $500,000 in 1990 currency. It was a sharp contrast, one spouse moving money in ways that raised questions, the other working to preserve what they had. A deeper search revealed that Marlene had recently spoken to a local attorney about divorce. It wasn't public knowledge, and no formal filing had occurred, but notes from that consultation indicated concerns about property division and preserving inheritance rights for her son. The meeting took place just 2 months before her death. The timing was significant. So was the fact that she hadn't told Michael. The forensic team wasn't just looking at documents. They were reconstructing patterns, a quiet legal consultation, a husband under business scrutiny, a wife beginning to separate assets. These weren't direct causes of murder, but in their experience, they were often the opening chapter. At the dealership, detectives reviewed employee records. Among the staff was a name that had surfaced twice in off-record conversations: Sheila Keene. She'd been working there since 1987, mostly as a repo agent. According to coworkers, she was reliable but intense, often out on assignments alone. She had access to vehicle keys, scheduling information, and had earned Michael Warren's trust. Several employees said they'd noticed Michael and Sheila spending time together, lunches, long conversations behind closed doors. No one accused them of anything specific. But in interviews, it became clear that their proximity hadn't gone unnoticed. At the same time, Marlene had grown increasingly wary. A neighbor recalled Marlene once confiding, "There's a woman around my husband. I don't like it." That comment didn't make it into any report at the time. But now it did. Investigators turned to receipts and vendor records. The florist confirmed the balloon and bouquet were purchased around 9:45 a.m., the morning of the shooting. Surveillance footage from the Publix entrance showed a woman, medium build, wearing a wig and sunglasses, leaving the store with the items in hand. The footage was too degraded for facial recognition, but the clothing matched descriptions given by witnesses who saw the clown at Marlene's door. The costume store had a matching purchase the day before. One full clown set, including orange wig, white gloves, oversized shoes, and face paint, paid in cash. The staff didn't remember the customer clearly, only that she seemed quiet and avoided eye contact. The car rental agency, the link in the chain, had rented the white Chrysler LeBaron under the name Debbie Shannon. It was a name that didn't trace to any local ID. The phone number listed was disconnected. The address didn't exist, but the signature on the rental form was collected and logged. Investigators assembled the sequence. Clown costume purchased on May 24th. Chrysler LeBaron rented on May 25th. Flowers and balloons bought on May 26th at 9:45 a.m. Marlene Warren shot at 10:45 a.m. Each step was time-stamped. Each was within a 10-mile radius. None of it had been impulsive. The car was found abandoned 2 days later in a Winn-Dixie parking lot. The inside had been wiped. No blood, no fingerprints. But in the carpet under the passenger seat, a single synthetic fiber was recovered. Orange, manufactured plastic, consistent with costume wig material. It was logged, bagged, and sent for analysis. In 1990, mitochondrial DNA testing wasn't widely available. That result would take years. Back in the interview room, Detective Swan reviewed the layout again. 4 stops, cash only, disguised identity, no digital trail. It was too coordinated to be coincidence. The data aligned too cleanly, he noted quietly into his tape recorder. Sometimes that's the problem. By the end of week 1, law enforcement had the physical framework of a crime, but no name they could attach to it with certainty. Still, there was an undercurrent among the team. Whoever planned this knew Marlene's habits. They knew her door would be unlocked. They knew she'd answer, and they didn't hesitate. There's a point in every homicide case where the evidence stops answering questions and starts asking them. By the second week of the Marlene Warren investigation, detectives had a fully mapped timeline, triangulated forensic points, and a crime scene that all but screamed premeditation. But they didn't have a name. Not one they could officially connect to the act. What they did have was a suspect profile quietly beginning to take shape. A woman. Local. Calculated. That profile was getting sharper by the day. The Chrysler LeBaron, recovered from a strip mall parking lot in Royal Palm Beach, yielded no usable prints. No blood, no items left behind except a single orange synthetic fiber found embedded near the floor mat. Analysts had confirmed it matched commercially produced clown wigs sold at the Spotlight costume store, a purchase logged 2 days prior to the murder. A review of store receipts had narrowed the sale to a cash transaction. Handwriting on the store's in-house purchase log, intended for large rentals, was scribbled and incomplete, but the clerk had entered 2 words under notes: dark wig. From there, detectives revisited the Payless car rental record. The Chrysler had been signed out by a Debbie Shannon using a fabricated Florida address. The signature was compared with DMV files from the surrounding counties. No match. The phone number listed rang to a disconnected line. It was a ghost rental, intentional and anonymous. They went back to Bargain Motors. The dealership, managed by Michael Warren, employed fewer than 10 people at the time. One of them, as established in prior records, was a repo agent named Sheila Keene. Her time cards, pulled from old punch slips and office logbooks, became the next focus. On May 24, 1990, the day the clown costume was purchased, Keene had been signed out on a repossession task in Lantana, roughly 30 minutes from the Spotlight store. She clocked out at 4:12 p.m. The costume was bought at 4:37 p.m., May 25th. She signed out again, assigned to a recovery in Green Acres. The rental car pickup occurred in that same corridor 20 minutes after she left the office. May 26th, no repo assignment logged, no sign-in at the office, no alibi submitted. That morning, Marlene Warren was shot at close range on her own doorstep. The alignment wasn't proof, but it wasn't coincidence either. Detective Don Swan recorded in his case notes, "No one's naming her, but the evidence is moving around her and she's not moving away from it." They interviewed co-workers at the dealership. Most were reluctant. Some simply said she was professional. Others admitted she had a friendship with Michael Warren that went beyond regular hours. No one claimed to have seen anything explicit, but several staff recalled her returning from lunch in the same vehicle Michael drove to work. Then, quietly, one of the employees handed over a photocopy, an image he had taken from the back office bulletin board a year prior. It showed Sheila and Michael posing together at a company BBQ. Nothing inappropriate, but their proximity, shoulders touching, Michael's hand on her back, was noted. Marlene had never attended those events. Out of public view, detectives had begun developing a theory. It wasn't about proving jealousy. That's not enough. In Florida, as anywhere, motive only matters if you can link it to action. But what they had now was behavioral access, opportunity, and a temporal overlap between an employee's undocumented movement and a crime of high planning. Marlene's autopsy report had returned. Cause of death: gunshot wound to the head, fired at close range. Powder burns around the right cheek suggested the barrel was less than 12 inches from the skin. No defensive wounds. No hesitation from the shooter. Death was ruled a homicide, immediate and intentional. A .38 caliber round had been recovered from her skull. It was jacketed, standard issue. Not rare, not traceable to a single buyer without the weapon. And the weapon had not been found. The choice of disguise, the clown, the balloons, the bouquet, was unusual, but it wasn't random. Every piece was curated. Bought from different vendors, paid for in cash, worn once, then discarded. That level of coordination implied foreknowledge of Marlene's routine. Someone knew she'd be home, that she'd answer the door, that she wouldn't be alarmed by a costumed figure holding flowers. Detectives asked Michael directly if he had any idea who might have done it. His response was flat: "If I knew, I would have told you." He wasn't under arrest, but his interview tone didn't sit right with the team. No demands for justice, no personal theory, just rehearsed detachment. Behind the scenes, investigators sent a quiet request to the DMV, a handwriting comparison. They took the Debbie Shannon signature from the rental agreement and compared it to license applications in the surrounding Tri-County area, including current and former employees of Bargain Motors. The system flagged one record: female, known address in Lake Worth, former repo agent, name Sheila Keene. The match was not conclusive, but it was enough to shift the case into a different category, from open-ended homicide to target-specific inquiry, but they still had a problem. No weapon, no confession, no forensic DNA analysis available in 1990 that could confirm the strand of hair recovered from the LeBaron belonged to Sheila Keene or anyone else. They needed to wait, or the technology had to catch up. When a case stalls, it doesn't die, it waits. That's something you only understand if you've sat in the same office for years, seeing the same faces on the wall, the same unanswered questions in the files. The clown never came back, but the shadow it left behind, that never left the room. After weeks of interviewing, reviewing, mapping, and double-checking timelines, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office faced the same hard fact. They had no usable prints, no recovered weapon, and no one willing to speak under oath. There was no arrest and no indictment. And without forensic technology advanced enough to extract DNA from the limited evidence they had, a single synthetic fiber, a partial hair sample, and a signed alias, they couldn't push forward, so the case cooled. Marlene Warren was buried 2 weeks after the shooting. Her son Joe, who had witnessed it all, retreated from public view. Michael Warren didn't make many public statements. He never remarried, not immediately. Internally, the lead investigators kept the file flagged for reactivation. Sergeant Swan noted in a log entry dated August 1990, "There's something missing, either a false step in the plan or a detail we've overlooked. This wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to stall us, temporarily." What followed was silence. For nearly a decade, the case moved nowhere. But behind that silence, a timeline was still unfolding. In 2002, 12 years after the shooting, Michael Warren legally married a woman named Sheila Keene. They had relocated to Tennessee, where they opened a roadside restaurant called the Purple Cow. It wasn't high profile. No press, no interviews, just a couple living quietly under a different name. According to public records, she was going by Debbie in some circles. Yes, the same alias that had been used to rent the Chrysler LeBaron back in 1990. The local sheriff's office in Tennessee had no idea who they were. They blended in. Neighbors later described them as friendly, private, and kept to themselves. And unless someone had known about the case in Wellington, Florida, there'd be no reason to ask. But someone back in Florida was still asking. In 2013, the Palm Beach County Cold Case Unit restructured. A new digital evidence initiative allowed for reevaluation of legacy files, among them, the Marlene Warren file. A review analyst flagged the case because of an item marked inconclusive DNA from 1990. That triggered a fresh request to the state lab for reprocessing using newer mitochondrial DNA techniques. That's where the chain of custody became critical. The single hair strand retrieved from the Chrysler's passenger side floorboard had been stored properly. No contamination, still viable. The test took weeks, but when results came back, the strand was a familial match to Sheila Keene's mitochondrial profile. Not a definitive match under old standards, but under modern 2014 guidelines, it was enough to move the case. At that point, the cold case unit reopened the file formally. A new team, some younger, some veterans of the original task force, went back to the beginning. They revisited the timeline, rechecked florist records, located former employees at the costume shop and Payless car rental. Most didn't remember much, but some still had archived employment logs and transaction slips. The woman who purchased the clown costume in 1990, described as medium build, paid cash, wore sunglasses. One clerk remembered her asking how to apply face paint over makeup. That was never noted in the original file. But it mattered. It suggested intent not just to disguise, but to hide traces beneath the disguise. That small detail made it into the new forensic brief. From there, the investigators acquired utility records, DMV data, and property deeds. In 2002, Sheila Keene had changed her last name to Warren. She had sold her prior condo in Lake Worth and filed taxes jointly with Michael in Tennessee. And in those filings, the alias Debbie showed up again, used as a business name. When asked later why it took so long to reopen the case, one analyst explained, "It's not about negligence, it's about tools. We didn't have the tech to do this in 1990, now we do." There was still no murder weapon, no confession, but they now had a biological link from evidence to a known associate of the victim's husband, a clear timeline showing opportunity, motive, and access. A marriage that occurred 12 years later between the victim's husband and the only woman ever informally suspected. That brought the case back into active review status. And in 2017, law enforcement made the move. They located Sheila Keene Warren at her home in Abingdon, Virginia. She was arrested without incident, charged with first-degree murder in the 1990 shooting of Marlene Warren. The press dubbed it the killer clown case solved after 27 years. Behind closed doors, the officers didn't celebrate. One of them later said, "It wasn't closure, it was delayed accountability." But for Joe Aarons, for the people who watch that house every day, it was something you don't knock on a door after 27 years unless you're sure. When Palm Beach County deputies arrived in Abingdon, Virginia on September 26, 2017, they weren't making a gamble. They were closing a gap. Sheila Keene Warren answered the door at her brick home without resistance. She was calm. No outburst. No protest. According to the arrest report, she asked only one question. Is this about Florida? The formal charge, first-degree murder in the death of Marlene Warren, committed in May 1990. She was taken into custody, booked in Washington County Jail, and held without bond awaiting extradition. The warrant was based on new forensic support, a mitochondrial DNA match from a hair found inside the Chrysler LeBaron abandoned after the shooting. But the arrest affidavit didn't stop at science. It outlined a motive supported by relationship proximity, financial tension, and a timeline no longer considered coincidental. That arrest made headlines. National outlets picked up the story within hours. Killer clown case reopened, ran across cable banners. The oddity of the disguise overshadowed the reality of the crime. But detectives had never cared about headlines. Their focus now shifted to logistics. Transporting a suspect from another state under a cold case indictment isn't fast. Extradition required review, approval, and court appearances. Sheila waived her right to contest. She was flown back to Palm Beach County in early 2018. At her first Florida appearance, prosecutors announced their intent to pursue life imprisonment. There was no death penalty filing at that stage. Michael Warren did not attend. The prosecution moved carefully. They had no confession, no murder weapon, no fingerprint match. But they had a cumulative case, DNA analysis placing her hair in the getaway vehicle, a documented romantic link to the victim's husband, evidence of a cash-only disguise purchase within 48 hours of the murder marriage to the same man 12 years after the crime. Alias match between Debbie Shannon and a known pseudonym she later used in Tennessee business filings. Defense attorneys argued circumstantial weight doesn't equal proof. Their strategy relied on suppressing the DNA results as inconclusive and framing the arrest as retroactive speculation. They also claimed that in 3 decades, no eyewitness had identified Sheila in or near the Warren home on the day of the murder. The court issued a protective order sealing key exhibits before trial. Jury selection was delayed repeatedly, once due to discovery disputes, then later due to pandemic-related court closures in 2020 and 2021. Each delay added pressure to the case, especially on Marlene's son Joe Aarons, now an adult with his own children, attending hearings silently in the back row. In internal memos, prosecutors debated trial risk. Juries remember clowns and costumes, but they also noticed gaps. There was no surveillance footage showing Sheila in costume, no witness who saw her enter or leave the car. The science was real, but built on mitochondrial DNA, not nuclear, which can't pinpoint identity, only maternal lineage. Behind the scenes, law enforcement considered a controlled pivot. In April 2023, prosecutors offered Sheila Keene Warren a plea deal, second-degree murder capped at 12 years with credit for time served. She accepted. Sheila did not admit specific actions, no confession to wearing the costume, holding the gun, or pulling the trigger. But by pleading guilty, she accepted responsibility for Marlene Warren's death. At sentencing, the judge reviewed the timeline flatly. From May 26, 1990 to April 2023, the system had waited. Sheila Keene Warren was sentenced to 12 years. Factoring in her pretrial detention, she would be eligible for release in 2024. Outside the courthouse, one detective stood quietly near the media line. He didn't speak to cameras. He didn't need to. He just watched the last vehicle pull away and said, mostly to himself, "It's not justice, but it's something, and it took long enough." Sometimes a case ends on paper, but not in practice. In April 2024, just 1 year after Sheila Keene Warren accepted her 12-year plea deal for second-degree murder, she walked out of prison. Her sentence had been reduced with credit for time served during pretrial detention. Total, 6 years, 5 months, 17 days. That figure was difficult to absorb for the people who had waited almost 3 decades. Sheila's release was processed early in the morning. No cameras, no press. She left through a secured exit escorted by her attorney and disappeared from Florida jurisdiction. Her legal debt was considered paid. But in Wellington, the neighborhood where Marlene Warren was shot through the face by someone in a clown costume, the past didn't leave so quietly. Joe Aarons, now in his 50s, issued a brief statement through a family liaison. There's no real closure, just absence. He declined interviews. His children never met their grandmother. Her name lived on in court records, not family dinners. Law enforcement didn't issue any additional charges. Michael Warren remained legally untouched. No subpoena, no indictment. Despite years of suspicion and circumstantial ties, including the later marriage to the accused, no direct evidence linked him to the planning or execution of the crime. Some detectives privately still questioned that. One retired investigator who had followed the case from 1990 to its resolution said during a closed seminar for criminal justice students, "You can plan something so well that you stay out of the paperwork, but that doesn't mean you weren't there in the planning room." The statement didn't name names. It didn't have to. Back in Tennessee, the Purple Cow restaurant had long since shut down. The house where Sheila and Michael lived under new names had been sold before her arrest. Financial records showed the couple had liquidated assets before 2017, just before she was charged. Public curiosity faded, but in the true crime community, the case gained a second life. Podcasts, documentaries, and news specials revisited the investigation. Some focused on the clown costume, others on the oddity of a cold case revived after 27 years. But few focused on the gaps. There were no fingerprints on the gun because the gun was never found. The bullet retrieved from Marlene's skull couldn't be traced to any known weapon. The orange wig fiber, while matched to retail costume batches, could never definitively place Sheila inside the costume. The mitochondrial DNA result remained the only biological evidence tying her to the crime scene, and even that could only narrow the source to a maternal lineage. Not enough to convict at trial, but enough for leverage in a plea deal. Technically, the system worked. A charge was filed, a plea was accepted, a sentence was served. But for many involved, the outcome felt more like a transaction than accountability. In true crime, resolution doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it just means the case has reached a point where there's nothing more to do. The files get stamped, the exhibits boxed, the open warrants closed. But the story doesn't go quiet just because the courtroom does. For those who followed this case from the very beginning, one question remains suspended in the quiet. If justice delayed is better than none, how much of it is still missing? There's a difference between solving a case and understanding why it stayed unsolved for so long. The arrest and conviction of Sheila Keene Warren might have concluded the legal chapter, but it raised a quieter, more uncomfortable question within law enforcement. What signs did we overlook? To find those answers, a review board at Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office initiated an internal debrief in late 2024. It wasn't about blame, it was about systems. What had been available in 1990? What hadn't? What needed escalation that didn't receive it? One of the first points raised: the Chrysler LeBaron. That car, central to the getaway, had been recovered less than 2 miles from the florist shop where the balloons were purchased. At the time, the crime scene unit had collected fibers and latent prints, but without the tech to cross-reference partial strands or degraded samples, nothing actionable came from it. By 1991, the car had been released from evidence. In retrospect, the car had carried the only DNA connection that would matter 27 years later. Then came the timeline compression. Within a 48-hour window, a woman had purchased a clown costume, rented a car using a false name, bought a bouquet and balloons, and appeared at a suburban front door with a loaded weapon. It wasn't spontaneous, it was methodical, but no surveillance footage placed any suspect clearly at those locations. In 1990, most security systems were analog, time-stamped but unreliable, blurry or already overwritten by the time subpoenas came through. Detectives reviewing the original logs noted inconsistencies in follow-up. The costume shop clerk described a nervous woman in sunglasses. But that interview had been conducted 2 days after the homicide, logged quickly, and filed without follow-up. She was never shown a photo lineup. The florist's assistant remembered the "You're the Greatest" balloon. No other customer requested that specific combination that week. But again, there was no surveillance review from inside the store because it had been taped over by then. These weren't mistakes in isolation. They were gaps, the kind that stack when pressure is high and resources limited. What stood out most, however, was the proximity. Sheila Keene wasn't an unknown figure. She worked for Michael Warren. She had access to dealership vehicles. She had operational independence as a repo agent. Her assigned routes went largely unmonitored, and employees had noted her growing presence around the office long before Marlene Warren's death. But none of them had formally connected those observations to the crime until years later. Why? Because no one had been asked to, at least not in a structured, on-the-record setting. One internal reviewer phrased it simply: she was too close to be visible. That's a pattern in many of these cases. By the early 2000s, when Sheila and Michael had married and relocated, their connection became public record. But by then, the case had already chilled, and cold cases often go quiet unless someone actively advocates for them. In this one, it was a combination of a new forensic director, a federal grant for DNA backlog processing, and the persistence of one sergeant who flagged the Warren case again in 2013. Without that convergence, the mitochondrial analysis may have never been requested. When we talk about justice delayed, it often sounds like a legal phrase. But for the people in those early rooms, the ones who collected evidence, who interviewed witnesses, who typed the reports, it becomes a personal ledger. Did we do enough with what we had? Did we push where we should have paused? Looking back, the answer is complicated. They did what the system allowed, but it wasn't enough. It was early 2025 when I stood again in front of the Wellington residence where Marlene Warren had been shot in the face, at close range, by a person dressed as a clown. The palm trees swayed above the roofline, casting flickering shadows across the garage door. On the surface, it looked like any quiet Florida home. But this place had been the backdrop for one of the most unsettling crimes in Palm Beach County's history. And even though the legal system had finally closed its books, the question still hung in the air like humidity in July. Sheila Keene Warren had pled guilty in April 2023 to a reduced charge of second-degree murder. She received a 12-year sentence with credit for time already served. She could be out as early as 2025. After 33 years of legal limbo, the case had ended, not with a dramatic trial, but with a quiet plea deal, one that left many, including investigators, with a gnawing sense of unfinished business. From the outside, the outcome seemed like a win for prosecutors. After all, Sheila had spent years avoiding arrest, hiding behind a new life, a new name, and even a new marriage, ironically, to the very man she was accused of conspiring with. The plea ensured she admitted her role in Marlene's death. But for those who had worked the case from the beginning, justice had never felt so incomplete. Michael Warren was never charged. To this day, he denies any involvement. And while prosecutors maintained they didn't have enough admissible evidence to indict him, many in law enforcement remained unconvinced of his innocence. The motive had always been clear: money, freedom, and a new life. But motive without sufficient evidence is just theory. In a courtroom, theory isn't enough. What made this case particularly difficult to swallow was the timeline. 33 years passed between the murder and the arrest. Key witnesses had died or faded into obscurity. The physical evidence, ballistic traces, wig fibers, clown costume fragments, had to withstand the deterioration of decades. DNA testing helped bolster the case in 2014, but it wasn't definitive. The hair found in the getaway car, though consistent with Sheila's mitochondrial DNA, couldn't conclusively prove guilt. It pointed, but it didn't pierce. Even more frustrating were the limitations of 1990s forensics. No surveillance footage, no cell phone triangulation, no digital breadcrumbs. What the case relied on were inconsistencies, lies, and circumstantial behavior. Sheila purchasing a clown costume, showing interest in orange Chrysler LeBarons, buying balloons and flowers just before the murder, and marrying Michael years later. Together, it painted a dark mosaic, but without a single tile screaming guilty. The investigators I spoke with off-record described this case as one that kept aging like milk. As years passed, the clarity of the crime eroded. Evidence lost relevance. Illegal standards changed. Witnesses became unreliable. And most painfully, the Warren family fractured. Joseph Warren, Marlene's son, was present when the clown knocked on the front door that morning in 1990. He witnessed the balloons, he saw the shooter, and he lived with the horror of that moment for over 3 decades. The case wasn't just about justice for his mother, it was about whether the system would ever validate the trauma he had carried alone. What haunts many isn't just the facts of the case. It's the reality that justice is often dictated by timing. If the arrest had come in 1991, the state might have had stronger evidence, a jury with fresh memories, and a better chance at full accountability. Instead, we got a plea bargain in 2023, on the eve of trial, under the weight of decayed evidence and exhausted will. But here's where perspective matters. Sometimes justice isn't about a perfect verdict, it's about refusing to forget. It's about persistence, chasing leads, keeping files open, returning to cold evidence even when the world has moved on. The detectives in Palm Beach didn't let go, and in the end they got a confession. Not perfect, not complete, but not nothing. Cases like this expose more than cracks in the system. They reveal the cost of delay. They raise questions about how long justice should wait and what compromises we're willing to make to get closure. They force us to ask what it means to win when the truth is partial and the loss irreversible. And yet, despite it all, this case reminds us of something else. Memory has power. A woman dressed as a clown murdered someone in daylight. It became a media circus. But underneath the headlines was a real human being, gunned down in front of her child. That reality, unfiltered, human, tragic, is what makes stories like this matter. Not because they're bizarre, but because they're real. Marlene Warren wasn't a punchline. She was a mother, a wife, a neighbor. Her life ended in horror. Her story deserves to be remembered. Not for the clown wig, but for the silence that followed. I've spent years following stories like Marlene Warren's, cases that haunt you not because they're sensational, but because they're real. This one reminded me that justice delayed can still be justice pursued, that the quiet persistence of investigators and the strength of victims' families can move even the coldest cases forward. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: truth has no expiration date. What do you think about how this case ended? Was justice served, or was it simply compromised? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, tell me where you're watching from. If you felt something from this video, Whether it sparked a memory, a question, or even just a chill, go ahead and hit subscribe. I've got more stories ahead that matter just as much.